Welcome back to Sealx Networks, and happy to introduce the final programming block of today, which covers joint ventures, tax updates, and resourcing and recruitment in Suriname. I just wanted to mention now that there will be a survey link posted at the end of today. So once you see that barcode, please do provide your feedback. It always helps us improve these sort of projects and services for future editions. So the next presentation is a presentation on joint ventures, which I think is extremely important for doing business in Suriname. The presenter is Hans Limapow, partner, Limapow Law Firm. Hans joined the firm in 1999 and has been a partner since 1997. He's been regularly sought after in the area of cross-border joint ventures and acts as a local counsel to several companies in the oil and gas industry in Suriname.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Hans Limapow. I work with Limapow Law Firm, and I am invited to do the presentation today on joint ventures. The presentation is called Introductory Thoughts on Joint Ventures, as you can see on slide 1. The presentation is developed against the background of the Suriname Oil and Gas Summit networks tailored to investment and business development in Suriname, and to assist the participants in growing their business in Suriname. This presentation is prepared under the assumption that Suriname law applies. I will first give a short introduction and then elaborate on 2 overriding principles to which parties considering to enter into joint venture negotiations should abide by. The presentation will then briefly point to the 2 common forms of joint ventures under Suriname law. Then I point to some characteristics of the Memorandum of Understanding as a prelude to the joint venture agreement. I will follow up by briefly pointing to 3 typical clauses relevant to include in the joint venture agreement. I conclude with some final thoughts. Introduction. The joint venture is arguably considered the most satisfactory means of achieving objectives which are beyond the capabilities of either prospective joint venture party on its own. It is a suitable medium for one party to solicit the capital investment of another with similar needs or interests in order to reduce the risks and costs of adventure, or to create an enterprise large enough to overcome the entry barriers of a given field. The new enterprise is not intended to become the dominant activity of either or both of the parties. If such were the case, the better route would be to unite on a permanent basis by way of an acquisition or merger. The proposed enterprise is intended only to create narrow community of interests between the 2 parties, and thus establishing a link of by means of a joint venture is often the preferred route. The dilemma of autonomy versus control. In most joint venture arrangements, the parties face a fundamental dilemma. On the one hand, they want the joint venture to have the authority to run its business itself. And on the other hand, they want to know that the necessary safeguards are in place to ensure that their interests will be protected. A key question is thus how to give the management of the joint venture appropriate decision-making powers while at the same time protecting the interests of the joint venture parties. There are two relevant overriding principles to which parties should subscribe when considering entering into a joint venture, as we see on slide 2. The first principle is that unlike mergers and acquisitions, which require complete accord at only a single point in time, a joint venture necessitates continuing agreement between the parties as to the nature and scope of the enterprise. Thus, the potential parties must focus on the venture and attempt through extensive negotiations to define its scope, the standards they will adopt, the market that they plan to enter, and the size and possible lines of growth of the venture. Each party must understand the motivations and interests of the other, what it intends to gain by the venture, what changes it might wish to make, and what alterations it is likely to propose. By a long and deliberate process of discussion and negotiation, the parties should explore every conceivable area of potential conflict until they come to a realistic understanding of the nature and limits of their community of interests. The second principle is that of compatibility of the parties. Fundamental conflicts may arise, say, between one party with a risk-taking philosophy and one committed to a conservative pattern of corporate growth, or may result from the joining of two parties of disparate size or with significantly different cash positions. The choice of party is thus the first and most important business decision to be made when considering establishing a joint venture. Unless there is trust between the parties, and unless there is a substantial unity of interest, the joint venture approach will indeed be a risky one. Where these criteria are met, the problem of serious disagreement will often be more theoretical than real, in particular with regard to parties of stature in their particular industry. Such parties are likely to be managed by individuals with similar experience, attitudes, and values, leaders in the business community who can be expected to act reasonably in an effort to avoid critical disagreements. Depending on their interest and desired involvement in the conduct of the joint venture's affairs, compatibility with non-industry partners may be less critical. International investors, for instance, are mainly interested in guaranteed return and an exit option. Now we go to slide 4. How do we get there? How do we get to the signing of a joint venture agreement? The Memorandum of Understanding. At the outset of negotiations, joint venture parties will generally have to address 3 concerns: the objectives of the negotiations, the rules of the game relating to the negotiations, the consequences if the negotiations break down. The first concerns the content of the deal and its delimitation, whereas the second and third relate to the process of the deal and, in essence, its protection. As a means of allaying these concerns, potential joint venture parties will often look to sign a document shortly after the commencement of negotiations, which records their intentions with regard to the 3 concerns just mentioned. This document could also be labeled heads of agreement, heads of terms, terms of reference, or letter of intent. More often than not, when preparing such a document, the potential joint venture parties tend to focus on the wrong issues. If one were to ask the parties why they enter into such documents, the majority would say it is to set out the principal terms of the deal formally in writing. This approach is arguably misplaced. Potential joint venture parties should in fact rather be focusing on the second and third concerns, namely the process of the deal. All too often, parties will spend time debating whether or not to make an MOU legally binding. As far as the parties' objectives are concerned, namely the principal terms of the joint venture, they will in most instances not be legally binding as they lack certainty. The very reason why parties will enter into negotiations rather than conclude an agreement immediately. However, the MOU will arguably be binding in as much as it relates to the process of the deal. In essence, the parties will be obliged to behave in a particular way in relation to the negotiations, that is to say, in good faith. An MOU can thus act as a useful framework for the negotiations, giving parties focus as to their objectives, but can generally only bind morally in relation to their content as opposed to the process of negotiations. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for me to conclude. I wish you all success and joy in matching each other's interests and in the new ventures that may lie ahead. Thank you.
Fantastic, and a really interesting presentation. And from a global event partners point of view, we are a company built on joint ventures. I think 90% of our events across 3 different continents are in JVs. So it's really interesting to hear that kind of explained in detail. And I think, you know, JVs are built on trust and mutually beneficial objectives and long-term partnerships. So yeah, fantastic presentation. Moving on to our next presenter, we've got a presentation on Suriname tax updates for 2023. The presenter is Kimberly Schraders, the Executive Director of Tax at Ernst & Young. Kimberly obtained her tax degree at Utrecht, the Netherlands, and started her career with a Dutch leading law firm in Amsterdam. In 2012, she joined EY in Curaçao and relocated to Suriname, where she opened the EY office in January 2019. She has extensive experience in national and international tax planning and reorganizations in the Netherlands, the Dutch Caribbean islands, and Suriname. She has also extensive experience in mergers and acquisitions practice throughout these jurisdictions and various sectors. At the moment, Kimberly is the Executive Director with the EY office in Suriname. She has a leading role in the Suriname tax practice and supports clients from different sectors of the industry, yet most clients are active in the emerging oil and gas sector.
All right, good day, folks. My name is Kim Schraders. I'm Executive Director with EY in Suriname. And up to me to bring you up to speed when it comes to the latest tax developments in Suriname. Fortunately, there have been quite a few, right? So there's plenty of topics to be discussing. Unfortunately, I only have 10 minutes, right? So if at the end of this quick presentation you still remain with unanswered questions, please feel free to reach out. I will end this presentation with my contact details. So again, feel free to connect. All right. Let's get started. Before we get into the the nuts and bolts. A quick disclaimer: this presentation is by no means intended to be entirely complete and provide you with all the ins and outs, but still, it's intended to provide you with the highlights. Let's move on. The agenda. So 4 topics that I wanted to discuss with you guys: wage tax, personal income tax. Then we will move on to the value-added tax, and then we will touch on the tax jurisdiction, and then we will end the 10 minutes with changes to the Petroleum Act. That being said, wage tax and personal income tax. The wage tax is a pre-levy on the personal income tax. So what you often see is that changes to the wage tax also reoccur in Personal Income Tax Act and vice versa, right? So the important change, which became effective as per the 1st of January 2023, that was the tax-free allowance. That used to be an amount of 48,000 SRDs. That was increased to 90,000 SRDs. You may argue that converting these amounts to US dollars, it may not be so impactful as one may wish, but still, in the bigger scheme of things, it's quite a shift. Actually, this was mainly a reaction to the introduction of the value-added tax, right, as per the 1st of January of 2023 as well. With the introduction of the VAT, you saw an increase of prices, and to provide people with some sort of relief, this tax-free allowance was significantly increased. Same goes actually for the exemption, right? There already used to be one in the legislation for bonus, for vacation allowance, and then the annual exemption used to be 6,516 SRDs, and that was increased to an amount of 10,016 SRDs. As I mentioned, wage tax, pre-levy and personal income tax, so same changes. So the tax-free allowance was also included in the personal income tax. The personal income tax, also important that the tax brackets were changed. So both in the wage tax and the personal income tax, you see the mechanics that depending on the amount of the salary, a certain percentage of tax applies, right? The tax brackets. Now with the increase of the tax-free allowance, the tax brackets also need to be amended. So that was all done. And then one last item, which is a personal deduction, and is more of interest to individuals that are actually resident in Suriname and not so much the non-resident individuals as they would likely not have a residency in Suriname in the first place. But still, and that relates to interest paid on mortgage debt, right? So that deduction was capped actually at an amount of 125,000 SRDs. That personal deduction was increased to an amount of 600,000 SRDs. So not bad. Okay, let's move on to the value-added tax. So this kept us quite busy, right, for the last at least half a year, and I expect that it will still keep us busy. So the value-added tax became effective as per the 1st of January 2023. Unfortunately, no grace period was included in the legislation. There was quite a lot of demand for a grace period, but at the end of the day, it wasn't included, at least not formalized in legislation. The tax authorities did express that at least during the first half year, they would not enforce the legislation in a very harsh manner. So they will not enforce and come with fines and administrative sanctions and all that jazz. So they do recognize that changes were made last minute, that businesses had very little time to become compliant. So in other words, they're willing to give you the benefit of the doubt. Do note that the authorities did indicate that if somebody acts with gross negligence or with intent and is therefore non-compliant, that they're not very forgiving for those cases. So as I mentioned, still changes to be to be expected. At the 30th of June, that will be a moment that we will reevaluate what is working, what is not working, what should we change, what should we further elaborate it, and so forth and so forth. So this is only the status at this point in time. If you look at contractors, subcontractors, and the Suriname state-owned company, they enjoy a specific treatment when it comes to value-added tax, right? So for all transactions, and let me elaborate on that specific item, the zero VAT rate applies. And with all transactions, I mean the import of goods and the delivery of goods locally in Suriname and the provision of services to these parties. So, to put it short, import of goods by contractors, subcontractors, Suriname state-owned company, and the supply of goods and provision of services to contractors, subcontractors, and the Suriname state-owned company. Those are all zero VAT rated. Nevertheless, in most cases, you see that there's an obligation to register for VAT purposes. And why is that? Because the legislation pretty much requires that every business, and you qualify very fast as a business, should be subject to VAT. The only exemption is if there's an annual gross revenue which is less than 1 million on an annual basis. Well, in most cases that amount will be exceeded, as 1 million SRDs converted into US dollars would amount more or less to 32,000 USD. So it's a fairly low threshold, and most companies will meet that threshold. So then there is an obligation to register for VAT purposes. That registration would result in monthly VAT returns, right? So even if there is a month where there is nothing to report, at least we would recommend to submit nil return. You would then be compliant, have met your filing obligations, and you would not be confronted with any surprises coming from the Suriname tax authorities. Now, what's the, if you compare the zero VAT rate with a VAT exemption, what is the upside of a 0% VAT rate? It safeguards basically that you still have the right to deduct input VAT, if any, right? Because in the ONG sector, most of the transactions will be subject to 0% VAT rate. However, there are also instances where the zero VAT may not apply. So at least with the zero VAT, which applies on the output side, it safeguards that you have a deduction of input on the input side. If the input exceeds the output, there's also a refund procedure included in the Suriname VAT legislation. So you would eventually would end up receiving funds from the Suriname tax authorities. So there is an exception to the rule when it comes to the zero VAT rate, and there are specific items in the legislation for which that rate doesn't apply. So in such event, you would fall back on the actual applicable rate, which often would be the 10%. And that applies to the supply of food, beverages, and tobacco. It's business relationship, gifts, and other gifts. Then there's the category of fringe benefits and entertainment. And then there's the item of motor vehicles. So for these items, again, the zero VAT rate doesn't apply. So you would have to fall back on the main rule, which is in general 10%. And also, if that VAT will be incurred, there's no possibility to deduct this as input VAT. That being said, let's move on. Tax jurisdiction, we're running out of time. Yesterday, actually, the Suriname Parliament voted on a law proposal to expand the tax jurisdiction for a broad range of taxes, varying from wage tax, personal income tax, value-added tax, estate tax, you name it. I have a full list here. in your specific sector, as mentioned in the second bullet, right? It's mainly going to be relevant for 3 categories of taxes, which is wage tax, personal income tax, and value-added tax. This change will become effective as of 1st February. So where the tax jurisdiction would consist of Suriname mainland and territorial waters. And you see that for these taxes, the levy territory is expanded to cover the entire exclusive economic zone, meaning that it used to be, as I mentioned, mainland territorial waters, which is a zone of 12 nautical miles from the landline. Now the exclusive economic zone is more or less 200 nautical miles at sea. So with this, they're expecting to generate quite some income, and it's an important change. They've been talking about this for years, and now it finally came to pass. So this is definitely an important development to consider. Then last, the changes to the Petroleum Act. This is a bit less interesting, but for the sake of completeness, I've added it. They added the definition of contractor party. And why is that relevant? Because 3 specific exemptions were actually included in the Petroleum Act. So there used to be a decree, and that decree was quite controversial, to put it short. And one of the controversies with regard to this decree was that it wasn't included in a formal law. And because it wasn't included in the formal law, it was considered unconstitutional. And therefore, there was a whole discussion if taxpayers could even derive rights that were included or that would follow from that decree. Anyway, long story short, they decided we need to take action. Certain, especially tax exemptions, which are included in the decree, should have a basis in the formal legislation. And that was the aim of this specific change, to have exemptions included in again, a formal law, in this case, the Petroleum Act. So what are the exemptions at hand? It concerns sales tax, which unfortunately doesn't exist anymore, right? Because the value-added tax took over 1st of January and replaced the sales tax. So the first bullet is, at this point in time, not so relevant anymore. And at the time of the passing of the law, it was the end of 2022. So also the relevance in that respect wasn't very prominent. Then taxes on dividends, which is relevant because in principle, the dividend distributions to by Suriname established entities to non-Surinamese shareholders in principle subject to 25%. So this is a very important exemption. And then they also address the possible taxes on sale of an interest arising from a petroleum agreement. In other words, if a share interest in a production sharing contract is being sold, then at least that is not subject to taxes. And they expanded it even with the sale of shares of a contractor or a contractor party by non-Surinamese shareholders. So anyway, the changes of the Petroleum Act, yes, also a long debated topic. Finally, it happened. And that is where I would like to conclude. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out, and would be happy to continue talking about these subjects. All right.
Fantastic, and thank you very much, Kimberly, for that presentation. And I think, as Kimberly mentioned at the start of the presentation, it was just a snapshot, an overview the tax situation in Suriname, as of today, and that there's still further updates to come. And some of these discussions need a much more, much deeper dive. So that's why we really encourage everyone to reach out to the speakers and make sure they come to the main event. As this is really just a precursor to help build capacity and get people to start connecting before the main event in Suriname this June, the third edition of the Suriname Energy, Oil and Gas Summit and Exhibition. Just on that sort of point about connecting, I think, as I might have mentioned this morning, we had 250 plus registered viewers, and I think at our peak viewing time during the course of this half day of programming and business matching, we had 223 viewers online, which is a fantastic number from the total amount registered. And I think already today, 71 separate video calls have been conducted, which works out at about 2.3 sort of calls per user. So it's been fantastic interaction, I think, in the back end along the side of the programming. And yeah, I would like to move on to our final presenter now. And I'm very happy to welcome Serona Samora, who's going to make a presentation on resourcing and recruitment in Suriname, which is obviously hugely important for building your business and presence. She's the Vice President of Eldorado Offshore and covers Trinidad, Guyana, and Suriname. So just to give you a little bit of background, Serona is the VP of the recruitment and manpower agency Eldorado Offshore in Trinidad, Guyana, and Suriname. She holds a BSc and an MSc degrees from the University of the West Indies. She was recognized as one of the top 10 most influential people in staffing and recruiting in 2022 for her work in the Caribbean markets by CIO Business Magazine in the USA. She was also recognized by Voyage Houston Business Magazine in the USA for inspirational female leadership in the energy sector. Her academic and professional experience has developed her as a thought leader in business development, human capital development, personal logistics, finance operations, and general management, predominantly in the oil and gas sector, industry, and regionally. As an offshore recruitment expert, Serona has accumulated both regional and international experience. She was notably the only female on her team stationed to lead the offshore recruitment project in Malaysia in the early days of the energy sector and her career. Serona currently manages and oversees all operations for Eldorado Offshore regionally. Eldorado Offshore has entities incorporated in Guyana, Trinidad, and Suriname due to the oil and gas exploration activities and discoveries there. Under her leadership, the team in each country were able to rapidly scale up Eldorado's offshore business with a headcount of 200 employees to now employing over 500 employees regionally within 1 year during the pandemic, which I think is a fantastic success story. One of the reasons we wanted to ask her to present. Her experiences within the academic, extracurricular, and professional roles from a young age have been the cornerstone of her success, allowing her to pivot and adapt as a young female leader, an executive in a male-dominated industry. Serona is a strong advocate for youth development and female empowerment, and at the workplace and at all levels. She looks to push boundaries and inspires those around her to do the same. Her innovation and creativity as an individual make her an asset to any role she serves. So looking forward to the presentation.
Hi, I'm Serona Samora. I'm the current Vice President of Eldorado Offshore, which has entities in Trinidad, Guyana, and Suriname. Thank you so much for the conference facilitators for asking me to speak at this prestigious event, as I will be presenting on resourcing and recruitment in Suriname. What I can tell you is Suriname is open for business and it's ripe with opportunities for international and regional investors. One of the main things about doing business in Suriname is that it's important to firstly assess the industry requirements, the workforce planning and training needs analysis of organizations in the energy sector before you start investing into Suriname. For companies who are interested in joining the energy sector in Suriname, Eldorado Offshore provides support in recruitment and manpower supply services. We currently provide candidates from Suriname in positions in the energy sector for a wide number of clients in top-tier positions in the sector. One of the things about Suriname that's important to also note is that it's essential to pay attention to local content development and regulations that guide those. If you truly want to embrace the beautifully broad spectrum of value creation, it's important to be mindful of human capital development. And local content development allows you to facilitate that with your companies once you set up business in Suriname. What I can tell you is resourcing and recruitment can become very simple in Suriname, even though initially it may be complex to set a business up. Once you comply with wage laws, employment laws, and taxation laws and regulations, it becomes seamless for you to operate in country. I urge all of you who are looking forward to joining the sector in Suriname, and to all of the investors who are paying attention as to when next they want to be part of the business forum in Suriname, to please be mindful of the institutional frameworks and the regulations and the laws that guide the sector and the business operations there before you set up business there. Once you comply with those laws and regulations, then it becomes seamless for you to operate. As it relates to resourcing and recruitment, Eldorado Offshore has a heavy influence with local content development. We directly contribute to local content development with the practices and processes that our team facilitates. We hire locals in the industry. And how do we hire locals? So a lot of people ask us, well, as a new market, how do you get skilled and experienced personnel to come and join your organization? And what we've done is we've consolidated all of the best practice and processes from different markets. We've consolidated the skills and strategy we've used in these markets to ensure that the workforce we put forward meets the industry standards, but also meets the training needs for the sector in Suriname. It's also important that when you assess locally what the needs are for the sector, you put a training plan in place, whether it is short-term, medium-term, or long-term, to ensure that the persons in Suriname are benefited from that training program and that they have a guide to ensuring that they know exactly where they need to be at every stage of the process. It's important to map out that process for them so these candidates are aware of what they need to do, what training courses they need to complete, which areas they need to focus on, what work experience they need to have to be able to get a job in the energy sector. At Eldorado Offshore, we are open to providing that guidance and advice to any company who requires setting up a business in Suriname or to understand the resourcing and requirements that their companies may need in Suriname. I urge you to please feel free to reach out to me privately or reach out to Eldorado Offshore on our website, and we would be able to provide information for you in greater detail about setting up a business in Suriname and also how we can support you with your resourcing and requirements needs there. Thank you again for the opportunity, and I look forward to taking your questions and engaging with you all.
Fantastic, and that includes our presentations today, and I think a lot of content there and a lot of fantastic insights on developing services and business opportunities in Suriname. I think, as I mentioned before, at our peak we had 233 active viewers, which out of 250 registrations is fantastic engagement. What we always find with online events is that the peak of engagement is during today and tomorrow when there's kind of live content. So capitalize that and make sure you keep sending those meeting requests, and we look forward to seeing you online tomorrow. There's another programming block another business matching block starting shortly. So please enjoy that. And as I said before, that the platform stays open till the end of February. All of the presentations and most of the speeches are already live or will be live, so you can rewatch them if you missed any of that. And then finally, and if somebody can just post that page on the platform, there's a QR code, and if you'd all be kind enough to scan that and fill in the survey, it will only take a moment. We would very much welcome your feedback. Thank you very much. Have a nice morning, afternoon, or evening, and we look forward to seeing you again online tomorrow.